Hello guys. Yesterday I came up with an idea for a coding convention that I think would be really nice for us to follow. So we discussed it with Vladimir, and I decided to create this video in order to showcase it to everyone. And I decided to make this as a video because it would be a lot easier to follow along and understand it overall. So let's jump right into it. I will try to be, um, you know, as thorough as possible while keeping it short. So let's suppose we have some class. This can be a component, it can be a service, doesn't really matter. And let's now suppose that we have this ID property, which is, as you can see, an optional property. And it gets initialized asynchronously. So basically, we have some API which has some method get stuff, and the stuff is basically some object which has the item ID. So we need to get the stuff in order to set our item ID. So this get stuff function, the get stuff method, it calls the getStuff methods of the API, and it doesn't need any parameters for it. So it doesn't really depend on anything. Uh, However, let's now suppose that we have something else. So we have this something property, which is also optional, which would also be initialized asynchronously. And then we have this function get something. So we have this some other API, which is this thing right here, which has this method get something, which accepts the item ID and returns a promise of something, which is currently just this empty class. We don't really care about it. So in order for us to get the something, we need to have the item ID. So currently in our code, most of the places we would encounter the following. In most of the places, we would encounter the following scenario. So instead of this item ID being passed here as an argument to the getSomething function, as I've done it at the moment, uh, it is actually accessed from the this, like so. So if I do it over here, you would see that I'm actually getting an error. Um, so I'm getting this error because my TypeScript version in this project is higher than the TypeScript version that we are using in our project. So in our project, we wouldn't even get this error to notify us that something might be wrong. So over here, I would have to assert that this thing would be defined using the exclamation mark. So that's how like a major part of the code is currently written. So as you can see, this is a bit problematic. Why? Because this function gets something when we want to call it from somewhere. For example, over here we want to call this get something. Uh, when we're calling the function, we are not directly able to see that this function actually depends on something, right? Like in our case, it depends on the item ID, which gets initialized asynchronously. So we could easily make a mistake of calling that function before the item ID has been initialized. So um, also by doing this, our function is not really pure, right? Because like the function is not like entirely pure either way. Even if we pass this as a parameter, it would still not be a pure function because it still accesses the this in order to set the something. But we can make it like as pure as possible. So my idea is to basically always provide values that may change over time through the function parameters. So in our case, the item ID, it may change over time because it gets initialized asynchronously. So aka it is not read-only. So it is a property used as a variable. It may change. So in that case, instead of depending inside the function to the item ID from the this, we would instead pass it as a parameter for the function, like so. By doing this, we achieve the following. First of all, we are directly able to see that the function needs the item ID in order to get invoked. So by having that, we now know, like out of the box, that we have to first initialize the item ID in order to call this function. So this allows us to seamlessly connect our flow, like our logic flow, without without even thinking about it, because we can basically see that the get something function needs the item ID. And also, this way we're keeping the function as pure as possible. Okay, so basically this is my suggestion. Now let's get back to the read-only part. So as I said, this thing may change over time. However, if we have something that is read-only, for example, like we have some, I don't know, imagine some read-only property, which is the type string, and is equal to, example, this. Or, yeah, anyway. So I would say that we could depend on read-only properties that are defined to be read-only in our class like this inside our functions, because they would be defined either, they would be assigned either at the moment of definition, like we have it over here, or they can be assigned in the constructor, right? This is what TypeScript allows us. So by doing this, we know that even if we depend on something that is read-only, it would not change. So that would not be problematic. So if here we need, for example, property which is of type string, like so, we can avoid passing it as a parameter to the function because it is read-only. Okay. So basically, this is my whole idea for the convention. So our functions should accept whatever may change over time as parameters, and then they can access the this just to set something, or they can access the this to get read-only things, but nothing else. They cannot get anything that is not read-only from the this. Like in our case, in the constructor, we're accessing these APIs, but like we usually don't change stuff in the constructor. Besides, we can also define them to be read-only to state that explicitly. So basically, that's the idea. So now let's delve a bit more into the read-only part. So now in our codes, Vladimir is doing the following approach in some places. So he saw that approach from actually the Angular source code. So what are they doing is basically, so let's consider the following scenario. Let's now consider that this component would have to be consumed by some outside components. For example, let's consider we have this class called parent component, which needs to access the component as a view child and use it somewhere. For example, do something with it. It doesn't matter what. So let's now say that this something that we have here, we want to make this to be read-only to the outside world. So we want to disallow outside users of that component to change this. So the way we are currently doing it in our project, following that approach that Vladimir is following from the Angular source code, is to do the following. So we could define the something to be read-only like this, and then since over here we'll get this error, we cannot assign because it's read-only, right? So in order to avoid the error, we will do the following. We will do this. So here this property example. So by doing this, we're basically casting the this as something else in order to set this read-only property. So that's our current way of handling it. And by doing this, we simply define this to be read-only. We did this cast, and now we're getting the error that we cannot assign anything to this because it's read-only. And the outside consumers cannot do anything. Cannot change it. So that's fine. However, I had something else on mind that I also want to suggest, and we can agree which approach we would follow. So Vladimir says that he likes this approach better, and I'll tell you why in a second. So let's first show you what I have in mind. So my idea is to basically, instead of defining this as read-only and casting the this and mutating it, to actually avoid that, but instead we can do the following. We can define the something to be non-read-only, like we had it before. Actually, this should be property. So we can define it to be non-read-only because we are actually changing it, right? And then by doing this, however, the outside world can now change it. Like we don't get an error here. So in order to disallow this to be changed from the outside world, we will do the following. We could extract an interface for this component where we would just provide the property to be read-only. We would declare the property to be read-only at the interface level. So we will do the following. So by doing this, this allows us to keep it as non-read-only in the class itself and change it without having to cast it to anything else. However, the outside world now, in order to actually comply with that, we need to use like the dependency inversion and polymorphism. So we have to say that the view child of this component is actually of type I component. So by doing this, we're depending on the interface, like we're applying the dependency inversion principle, and we're achieving the same effect. So those are the two approaches. So the part that Vladimir doesn't like about this is that we actually have to do a bit of extra work. Like we need to extract an extra interface in so this is an extra file, right? And then we have to also make sure to apply the dependency inversion principle when consuming the thing from the outside world. So those are the two things that we need to do in order to follow along the approach. Whereas if we use his approach, where we simply define it read-only and we cast this, we don't have to use dependency inversion and we don't have to extract an extra interface. So these are the pros and cons. So both of the approaches actually are not what you would actually see in an object-oriented language like C#, for example. Because as far as I know, in C#, you cannot define something to be read-only at the interface level, first of all, and you cannot define something to be read-only and then treat it as a non-read-only thing somewhere else in the class. So both of the approaches use syntactic sugar from TypeScript in order to achieve their goal. So the reason I actually came up with this approach with the dependency inversion, how does that actually contribute to the convention that I'm proposing? Well, basically, over here, we said that in our functions, we should never depend on values that change over time, that are not read-only. So that means that if we follow this casting, we cannot actually apply the approach entirely, because if we have something that is defined as read-only, we would blindly just use it like we've used this property here, which is read-only. But we cannot be sure that at some point somebody didn't just cast this like so and reinitialized it. So if this thing got reinitialized, we would actually have to call the function again, right? Because, for example, imagine we get some new item and we have to invoke the function to get the new something and so on. So basically, my idea would allow us to basically have like real read-only treatment of the properties inside the class. So that means that whatever is read-only, we would never change it. We will just treat it as read-only. And then we can apply this approach entirely. So we can depend safely on whatever is read-only without passing it as a parameter. Whatever may change, we would pass as a parameter, and we will just set things on the disk. So basically, set things on the disk, depend on the read-only properties inside the function, and pass whatever is non-read-only as a parameter over here. So that's the benefit of my approach. However, as I pointed out a bit earlier, my approach involves using the dependency inversion principle and adding an extra interface for this component. So I want to point out that those interfaces would not have to be added for all components. Like we would only add that when we have a scenario like this, basically where we have some class that consumes our class. So the consumer should not be able to modify it. So by using the read-only at the interface level, we achieve that. And yeah, that's basically everything. So it is up to you to decide whether you want to continue using this approach or use this one. So anyway, Uh, these approaches are like up for discussion. However, my initial suggestion can be used with both of them. It's just that if we're going to be using this approach, then we would actually have to also pass in the read-only properties as dependencies to our function, because we would not be able to safely know that they are not going to change, because we're treating them as read-only over here, but then we're changing them at some point. So that's it. Thanks for your time and cheers.